A heated confrontation erupts on a quiet city street when a police officer's arrogance collides with a young black woman's calm defiance. A simple notebook becomes the center of insult and power imbalance. But one powerful line from her hints that this story is far from ordinary. We don't need your kind writing lies in this neighborhood. The words tore through the air before the sound of the notebook's pages being ripped apart. The officer's voice dripped with contempt, each syllable as sharp as a blade. His hand yanked at the little leather-bound notebook, tearing the pages down the spine, letting fragments scatter across the pavement like broken feathers. The setting was deceptively peaceful, a tree-lined street at dusk, shopkeepers locking up, families walking home. Yet silence spread fast, for everyone could feel the tension humming like static. Faces peeked from behind curtains. A few passers-by stopped in their tracks. The quiet city corner had turned into a stage, and the officer, broad-shouldered in his navy uniform, had chosen to humiliate. He smirked, arrogance heavy in his posture. His badge glinted beneath the fading sun, an emblem he wielded like a weapon. "You think anyone cares about what you scribble?" He sneered, crushing another page in his fist. "People like you, always playing the victim. Not on my watch." In front of him stood a young black woman. She was barely in her 20s. Her curly hair tied back, her presence calm like an unshaken flame. She said nothing at first, only watched as her notebook, the one she had been writing in with quiet focus moments ago, was reduced to shredded paper at her feet. There was something unbothered in her stillness, as though his cruelty only revealed more about him than it ever could about her. Her silence was heavy, deliberate, and it unsettled him. A symbolic action followed. With one swift motion, he spat on the torn paper and ground it beneath his boot, looking around as if to collect applause. "See this?" he announced to the small crowd that had gathered. "Garbage belongs on the ground, just like the nonsense she writes." The woman finally bent down, not to pick up the pages, but to gently brush one single sheet free of dirt. She lifted it, holding it like a fragile truth, and looked the officer in the eye. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "You just stepped on something worth more than your badge," she said quietly, but her words cut sharper than a shout. The officer scoffed, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. He wasn't used to his insults being met with calm defiance. Then came her line, the one that shifted the atmosphere. "You should be careful whose words you try to silence. Sometimes they belong to people you'll wish you hadn't crossed." The street seemed to inhale. A few onlookers exchanged glances, sensing a deeper truth in her warning. The officer, annoyed at losing the upper hand, leaned closer. "And what's that supposed to mean? You threatening me, girl?" His tone sharpened, but the power behind it felt thinner now, less certain. The young woman tucked the salvaged page against her chest and took a slow step back. "Not a threat," she said. "Just a fact." Her eyes lingered on him for one last piercing moment before she turned, leaving the scraps of paper fluttering around his boots. The cliffhanger hung in the air, sharp and heavy. He had no idea whose notebook he had just torn, or how deeply. The consequences of that act were about to unravel his world. The pages of the torn notebook drifted like wounded birds across the pavement. Children on bicycles slowed down, their curious eyes following the scraps of paper that caught the evening breeze. One page clung to the wheel of a cart. Another floated to rest against the shoe of a shopkeeper. Every piece, every word, seemed to carry a quiet defiance. The officer planted his hands on his hips, scanning the silent faces around him. He wanted applause, validation, fear, anything that proved his dominance. But the street had shifted. No one clapped, no one cheered. Instead, they whispered. Why would he do that? One woman muttered under her breath, "Did you see how calm she was?" Another whispered to her friend. "Something's not right," an old man said, shaking his head. Their voices were low, but the officer heard enough to feel the sting. He barked at them. "What are you staring at? Go home." His voice echoed, but it lacked the certainty it once carried. The badge on his chest felt heavier than usual, as though it had become a burden instead of a shield. The young woman hadn't gone far. She walked slowly down the street, notebook page pressed to her chest, her steps unhurried. It was as though she knew the weight of every pair of eyes following her. The crowd seemed to lean toward her even as she disappeared into the soft glow of the street lights. The officer spat to the side, shaking off his discomfort. "Pathetic," he muttered, though the word felt hollow. He bent down to crush another page under his boot, grinding it harder into the cement, as if destroying paper could erase the unease crawling through him. But then he noticed something. One of the scraps had words scrawled across it in neat, flowing handwriting. He squinted, catching fragments beneath the streetlight. "They look at me, but they don't see me. They judge the skin before the soul. Still, I write, because my voice deserves ink even if their spit's ash." The words pierced deeper than he expected. For a moment, he felt as though they had been written about him, aimed directly at his arrogance. With a grunt, he balled the page in his fist and shoved it into his pocket. Though he couldn't explain why. Behind him, two teenagers whispered. "Man, she didn't even flinch. Did you see that?" "Yeah, she didn't yell, didn't cry. That's scarier than if she had." The officer spun, barking. "You two got something to say?" The boys quickly shook their heads and darted off. But the damage was done. His authority no longer commanded unquestioned obedience. It cracked, hairline fractures spreading through the mask he wore. He forced himself to straighten his posture. "Just another punk with a notebook," he said aloud, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. But deep down, something gnawed at him. Her final words. "You should be careful whose words you try to silence." He repeated them in his head, and each time they echoed differently. Not as a warning, but as a prophecy. His radio crackled at his side, breaking the tension. "Unit 47, do you copy?" He grabbed the receiver. "Yeah, this is 47. What's the situation?" A calm dispatcher's voice replied, "We've got a report of disturbance near Maple and 12th. Suspect already cleared. Do you need backup on your current location?" He hesitated. His pride wanted him to say no, to declare he had everything under control. But another part of him, the part unsettled by that girl's unbroken gaze, wondered if backup would bring comfort. Still, he chose. Arrogance. Negative. Area is clear. Just handled a minor loiterer. He shoved the radio back, his jaw tight. The crowd slowly dispersed, though glances lingered, whispers trailing behind like smoke. But even as the people moved away, the atmosphere remained heavy. It wasn't the kind of victory the officer was used to. It was hollow, fragile. He turned once more to the torn papers scattered on the ground. The words haunted him. He kicked one page, watching it tumble into the gutter. Yet his eyes were drawn again and again to the one folded in his pocket, the only page he hadn't destroyed. With a sharp breath, he started walking back to his patrol car. But every step echoed with the memory of her calm face, her unwavering words, and the lingering sense that he had just torn something he couldn't put back together. The night had settled heavy over the city, streetlights humming with a faint buzz. Officer Kane sat in his patrol car, arms resting on the steering wheel, staring into nothing. His shift was far from over, yet his mind was trapped in the earlier scene, torn pages scattering, whispers rising, her calm eyes piercing through him like quiet judgment. He cursed under his breath. Why couldn't he let it go? He'd humiliated dozens of people before. That was the job, wasn't it? Keep them in line, show authority, never let anyone challenge the badge. But tonight, felt different. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting back everything he didn't want to see. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled page he had kept. The handwriting stared back at him, steady, unbroken. He unfolded it with trembling fingers, reading the words again under the dim dome light of his car. They judge the skin before the soul. Still, I write, because my voice deserves ink even if there spits ash. His jaw clenched. He could burn it, tear it again, throw it out the window, yet something in him resisted. The page felt alive, as though destroying it would be admitting weakness. He struck a lighter, flame flickering near the corner of the sheet. For a second, the fire kissed the edge, but a gust of wind from the half-open window snuffed it out. Before it could spread, the paper remained, stubborn, refusing to vanish. Kane swore again, louder this time, and shoved it back into his pocket. He started the engine, headlights cutting through the empty street. But even with the car in motion, the words clung to his mind. As he drove, the city unfolded in fragments. Shuttered stores, neon signs buzzing, alleys painted in shadow. He saw people on corners, kids laughing as they chased each other across sidewalks, an old man carrying groceries too heavy for his frame. Every face seemed to echo her words. They judge the skin before the soul. For the first time in years, Kane felt something foreign prick at his chest. Guilt. He tightened his grip on the wheel, shaking his head. No, she was just another punk. Another liar trying to make me look bad, he muttered. But the words sounded weak, even to him. His radio crackled again. Unit 47, report your status. He pressed the button with unnecessary force. All clear. Yet it wasn't clear. Not in his head. Not in his gut. At a red light, he noticed a group of teenagers sitting on the curb, sharing fries from a greasy paper bag. They laughed, leaned against each other, talking in low voices. He remembered the two boys who had whispered earlier, how they had looked at him not with fear but with disbelief. It rattled him. For years, fear had been his tool. He knew how to command it, how to make people shrink back with a look, a gesture, a threat. But tonight, fear had slipped from his grasp, replaced with something he didn't recognize, quiet defiance. The light turned green, but he didn't move. A horn blared behind him, pulling him back. He hit the gas, heart thudding. When his shift finally ended, Kane parked in the back lot of the precinct. He should have gone inside, filed his reports, clocked out. Instead, he sat there, the page, burning in his pocket like a brand. Against his better judgment, he pulled it out once more. His thumb brushed over the ink, over words that now felt etched into him. For the first time, he wondered who she really was. Why her notebook seemed more than just paper. Why her calm silence carried the weight of someone untouchable. He remembered. Her final look, not anger, not fear, but certainty. Certainty that his actions would not be the end of her story, but perhaps the beginning of his undoing. The night pressed in around him. Kane leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, trying to steady his breath. But her voice echoed again, haunting, undeniable. You should be careful whose words you try to silence. For the first time in years, Officer Kane felt a chill run down his spine. And in that silence, he realized the story he thought he had ended was only just beginning. The precinct was quieter than usual, the night shift skeleton thin. A faint hum from the vending machine filled the silence, accompanied by the occasional shuffle of papers. Kane walked in, his boots heavy against the tiled floor, his jaw tight. He moved to his desk, tossing his cap aside, pretending to focus on the report in front of him. But the words blurred, refusing to settle. All he saw were ink-stained pages flying like ghosts. All he heard was her calm voice. Sometimes they belong to people you'll wish you hadn't crossed. He exhaled sharply, grabbing his coffee mug. It was cold, stale. he didn't care. He needed something bitter to drown the taste of unease. Across the room, Officer Miller leaned back in his chair, boots propped on the desk, scrolling lazily through his phone. "Rough night?" he asked, his tone casual, though his eyes flickered with curiosity. Kane shrugged, forcing a smirk. "Handled some girl loitering on Pine. Had a notebook. Thought she was some kind of activist." He made his voice dismissive, heavy with disdain. "Tore the damn thing up. Put her in her place." Miller's smirk faltered. His eyes lifted, sharp now. "Notebook?" Kane froze at the shift in tone. "Yeah, what of it?" Miller sat forward, boots dropping to the floor. "What did she look like?" Kane hesitated, suddenly aware that the air had thickened. "Young, early 20s maybe, black girl, curly hair. Wrote like she thought the world cared." He chuckled, but it came out forced, flat. The silence that followed wasn't casual anymore. Miller's gaze hardened, his phone slipping onto the desk. "You're an idiot, Kane," he muttered finally. Kane bristled. "Excuse me? You really don't pay attention, do you?" Miller leaned in, lowering his voice. "That girl you're talking about, she's not just some random writer. That's Judge Whitaker's daughter." The words hit like a gunshot. For a moment, Kane thought he'd misheard. "What? You heard me." Miller's tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "Sophia Whitaker. She's been writing those essays. You've seen them floating around online, yeah? Always about justice, race, the system. People actually read that stuff, and her old man? The one who practically owns this city's courtrooms. That's her father." Kane's throat went dry. His mind replayed the scene, the torn notebook, the crushed pages, his boot grinding words into dust. "That's impossible," he muttered, shaking his head. "She was just what?" Miller snapped. "Just another black girl you thought you could humiliate? You don't get it, do you? You didn't just rip up paper tonight. You went after the one person this department cannot afford to touch." Kane swallowed hard, his pulse racing. The name Judge Whitaker carried weight heavier than any badge. He was a man whose rulings shaped futures, whose influence stretched into every political corner of the city. Untouchable, respected, feared. And Kane had torn his daughter's words to shreds in front of witnesses. Miller shook his head, muttering, "God help you if she tells him." Kane forced a laugh, brittle, hollow. "She won't. She didn't even fight back. Just walked away, which is exactly why you should be worried." Miller's eyes narrowed. "She didn't need to fight. You. She already knows who she is, and now she knows who you are." The words lodged deep, twisting like a knife. Kane leaned back in his chair, suddenly suffocated by the walls of the precinct. The fluorescent lights above seemed too harsh, the hum of the vending machine unbearable. He thought of the salvaged page in his pocket, the one he couldn't burn. It felt heavier now, like evidence of his own undoing. For the rest of the night, Kane couldn't focus. Every sound in the precinct became amplified, the click of a pen, the shuffle of papers, the distant ring of a phone. His own heartbeat thundered louder than all of it. When he finally clocked out, stepping into the cool night, the city felt changed. The streets looked the same, but they carried a new weight, as though every corner hid a whisper of what he'd done. He lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply, trying to steady himself. The smoke curled around him, but it brought no relief. Judge Whitaker's daughter. He repeated the words like a curse. The torn notebook wasn't just paper anymore. It was a fuse. And Kane realized far too late that he had already lit it. The morning sun was merciless. It poured through Kane's blinds, slicing across his face until he woke with a groan. His shirt still smelled of smoke and sweat, his head pounding from the restless night. He dragged himself to the bathroom, staring into the mirror. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man looking back. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight. He splashed water on his face, muttering, "It's nothing. Just another night. Just another punk." But no matter how hard he tried, the name clung to him. Whitaker died at the precinct. The air was different. Kane could feel it the moment he walked in. Conversations dipped when he passed, laughter softened, eyes flicked toward him before darting away. He slammed his locker shut harder than necessary, trying to bury the paranoia rising in his chest. Miller's words echoed again. "You didn't just rip up paper. You went after the one person this department cannot afford to touch." Kane shoved the thought down, focusing instead on his routine. Patrol, paperwork, authority. But routine felt fragile now. A thin shell cracking under the weight of invisible eyes. It wasn't long before whispers reached him. Two rookies, standing by the coffee machine, didn't notice him approach. "Did you hear? He went after her? Judge Whitaker's kid?" "No way, you're kidding." "That's what I heard." Tore up her notebook. In front of a crowd. "Damn, if that's true, he's finished." Kane's hand tightened around his mug until his knuckles went white. He stepped forward, making his presence known. The rookies froze, stammering excuses before scattering. He downed the coffee in one gulp, bitter liquid burning down his throat. He wanted to scream, to remind them he was still the badge, still the authority. But deep down, he knew authority was slipping, not in shouts, but in whispers. That evening, the whispers traveled beyond the precinct. Across the city, in a quiet cafe, Sophia Whitaker sat with her salvaged notebook. Its cover was scarred, pages missing, but the words inside burned brighter than ever. She scribbled fiercely, her pen scratching truths that no boot could silence. She wasn't plotting revenge. She didn't need to. She simply wrote. Her words carried weight, and in a world eager for justice, her voice had already begun to spread. An older woman leaned over from the next table, curiosity in her eyes. "Sophia, is it true? What happened with the officer?" Sophia looked up, calm as ever. She offered only a small nod. "He tore my notebook, but he didn't tear my words." The woman reached out, squeezing her hand. "Your father will hear of this. The whole city will." Sophia smiled faintly, a quiet power radiating from her. "He doesn't need to. They already are." By nightfall, snippets of the incident had begun to ripple across social media. Witnesses who had stayed silent now found courage in recounting what they saw. Posts surfaced. Cop tore up a girl's notebook. She didn't flinch. Photos of scattered pages littering Pine Street appeared online. Captions demanding accountability. And woven into those whispers were Sophia's essays, already shared widely, now amplified by the story of her defiance. Kane didn't need to check his phone to know. He could feel it. The city's air shifted, carrying a storm that was building around him. That night, as he drove his patrol car through familiar streets, he noticed people looking at him differently. Not with fear, but with something sharper, recognition. At a stoplight, a young man crossed in front of his car, locking eyes with him. The look wasn't aggressive, it was worse. It was knowing. Kane gripped the wheel tighter, sweat beating at his temples. The page in his pocket, still there, folded, stubborn. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It felt like a curse, like carrying proof of his own undoing. Back at his apartment, the silence was unbearable. He turned on the TV, the radio, anything to drown the echo of her voice. But the noise only reminded him of the growing hum outside his control. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, Kane finally whispered aloud to no one, "What if Miller's right? What if she—" He stopped himself, shaking his head violently. "No, she's just a girl, just a writer. I'm the officer." I'm the law. But the words rang hollow, because deep down, Cain knew authority built on arrogance collapses quietly, not with a bang, but with the sound of a pen scratching truths that the world is finally ready to read. Sophia's pen had only just begun. The city had always bent beneath his boots. Cain knew the rhythm. His siren wail cut through streets, his badge commanded silence, his voice broke defiance. But tonight, as he drove down Maple Avenue, the city felt heavier. The rhythm was off. People didn't move out of the way like before. They watched him instead. At first, he told himself it was paranoia. Then he saw the mural. On the side of a brick building, fresh paint glistened in the moonlight. A girl's silhouette, notebook in hand, stood defiantly against a boot pressing. Down. Above her, words curved in bold letters. You should be careful whose words you try to silence. Cain slammed the brakes. The tires screeched, his heart hammering. A group of teenagers across the street turned to look. One of them pointed at him, whispering something. The other smirked, not afraid, amused. His chest tightened. He floored the gas and drove off, the mural shrinking in his rearview mirror but burning brighter in his mind. At the precinct, the whispers had grown into something sharper. A sergeant's eyes narrowed when Cain walked in. A clerk paused her typing. Conversations hushed not out of respect, but tension. He could feel the distance between himself and the rest of the room, as though an invisible line had been drawn. Miller leaned against the wall, arms folded. You seen it yet? He asked. Cain's voice was clipped. Seen what? The mural? Couple blocks off Pine. They're calling it The Page That Wouldn't Burn. Miller smirked, but it wasn't friendly. Your mess is all over. The city now. Cain's fists clenched. It's graffiti. It'll wash off. Miller shook his head slowly. Not this time. You don't get it. They're not scared of you anymore. They're listening to her. The words hit harder than he let on that night on patrol. Cain noticed it again and again. A mother pulled her child closer when he passed. A shopkeeper shook his head, muttering under his breath. Two young women laughed softly as they walked by, one of them holding a notebook that she raised deliberately as she caught his eye. It wasn't protest. It wasn't rage. It was worse. It was recognition. Everywhere he went, the city seemed to whisper Sophia's name. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of a bookstore, Sophia sat with her laptop. Her essays, once read by hundreds, now reached thousands. Screens lit up with her words. Stories of dignity against arrogance, of silence that spoke louder than violence. Her writing wasn't just about her own experience. It was about every face that had once lowered their eyes under the weight of a badge. Like Cain's, she typed with calm certainty, her words steady, deliberate. Power isn't in the boot that stomps, but in the voice that refuses to be silenced. They can tear our pages, but they cannot tear our truth. Within hours, the essay spread. Teachers read it aloud in classrooms. Activists shared it on street corners. Ordinary people whispered it to each other in grocery lines as if carrying a secret weapon of hope. And Cain felt it. During a late-night call, he pulled up to a corner store for what should have been a routine check. But when he stepped inside, the room went quiet. Customers froze, eyes fixed on him. A man near the counter set his notebook down deliberately, pages open. Cain swallowed, suddenly aware of the weight of every gaze. He barked, "Everything okay?" "Here." The store owner nodded stiffly. "Fine officer." His tone was polite, but cold. Cain lingered, scanning the room. No one moved, no one spoke. It wasn't fear that silenced them. It was defiance wrapped in quiet. For the first time in his career, Cain felt small inside a room. He left quickly, slamming the door behind him. Outside, he leaned against his car, pulling in ragged breaths. His hands shook, though he told himself it was just adrenaline. But deep down, he knew it was something he couldn't control. The city wasn't his anymore. That night, back in his apartment, he pulled out the page again. The ink stared at him, alive, unburned. His lighter trembled in his hand, but he couldn't bring himself to strike the flame again. The words had outgrown the paper. They were on walls, on screens, in people's eyes. Kane buried his face in his hands. The silence of his apartment pressed down, heavy, suffocating. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to break something. But he didn't. He sat there shaking, while the city outside whispered truths louder than his badge ever could. And in that silence, Kane realized the collapse had already begun. It began with a single bench. On a cloudy afternoon, Kane walked his usual patrol route through Jefferson Square. He had passed this park 1,000 times, once the self-appointed king of its cobblestone paths. But today the air was different. On the far side of the square, a young boy sat reading from a notebook. People gathered around him, listening quietly. Kane's chest tightened when he realized the boy wasn't reading his own words. He was reading hers. Sophia's sentences spilled from the boy's trembling lips. Even in silence, we are louder than their shouts. Even in stillness we stand, taller than their threats. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They simply listened, heads held high. And when Kane approached, boots striking the ground like thunder, no one moved. No one dispersed. "Clear the square," Kane barked. His voice echoed, but it bounced off their silence like water on stone. The boy's voice wavered, but did not stop. He kept reading. Kane's hand twitched toward his baton. But then his eyes met those of a woman in the crowd, steady, calm, unflinching. He turned to a man beside her, who folded his arms, his silence heavier than any insult. It hit him. Then, fear had drained from their faces. Kane's throat felt dry. He turned on his heel, storming away, but the silence followed him like a shadow. That evening, Sophia sat in her small room, lit only by the warm glow of her desk lamp. She had not expected this. Her words had left her hands like seeds scattered in the wind, but now they bloomed in places she could not see. Her inbox overflowed with messages, teachers sharing how her essays were read aloud in classrooms, workers saying her words gave them courage to speak against injustice, mothers writing that their children now carried notebooks instead of fear. Sophia placed her hand over the page that had survived Kane's flame. Its edges still bore the scars of fire, but the words within it glowed with new life. "Not mine anymore," she whispered. "Ours." She began typing again, each keystroke deliberate, heavy with purpose. The badge loses its weight when the people no longer bow. Power collapses when silence becomes a mirror. Days later, the silence spread. At a busy intersection, a crowd gathered during Kane's patrol. No chanting, no chaos, just men and women standing shoulder to shoulder, notebooks held in their hands like shields. Pages fluttered in the wind, a sea of unwritten stories daring him to try and tear them. Kane stood at the edge, pulse pounding. He shouted, "Disperse!" No one moved. He barked it again, louder, veins straining in his neck. Still, no one obeyed. Their silence became unbearable, a sound sharper than screams. His authority slipped through his fingers like sand. His fellow officers shifted uneasily beside him. Miller muttered, "They're not scared of us anymore." Kane's jaw clenched. He wanted to swing his baton, to break the silence by force. But something in the weight of their eyes froze him. He felt as if the entire city was staring through him, stripping him bare. One child near the front raised a torn page high above his head. Written across it in bold letters, "We are the page that will not burn." The crowd didn't chant it, didn't shout it. They simply stood. And that was worse. Kane's rage surged, but underneath it was panic. For the first time in years, he wasn't the predator. He was prey, cornered not by fists or fire, but by dignity he could not crush. That night, Kane sat in his apartment with the blinds drawn tight. The silence of the streets outside haunted him. Every whisper of wind sounded like the rustle of notebook pages. Every shadow seemed to carry Sophia's words. He stared at the page on his table, the one he had failed to burn. His hand shook as he picked it up. "What are you?" he whispered, as though the ink itself could answer. But the truth was clear. It was no longer just paper. It was a weapon sharper than anything he carried on his belt. For the first time, Kane felt powerless dot across the city. Sophia walked into Jefferson Square, where the boy had once read her words. Now dozens gathered there nightly. She didn't lead them. She simply sat among them, her notebook open on her lap. Someone whispered, "That's her." Heads turned. People smiled faintly, respectfully, but Sophia lifted her hand gently. "Not me," she said. "Us." The crowd nodded, and the silence deepened, stronger than any speech. And as the evening sun dipped behind the city skyline, Kane watched from a distance. His badge felt heavy, his chest tight. The square that once emptied at his command now filled with strength he could not bend. The silence of the crowd was louder than his sirens, louder than his shots, louder than his entire career. And for the first time, Kane understood. He wasn't just losing control. He was already forgotten. The precinct smelled of sweat, stale coffee, and fear. Kane stormed through the hallways, boots thudding against the floor. His fellow officers avoided his eyes, shifting aside as he passed. Once, they looked at him with respect, or at least with fear. Now their glances carried something else. Doubt. In the briefing room, Captain Harris stood waiting, arms crossed. The walls buzzed whispers. Another gathering in Midtown. Crowds outside City Hall. Nobody's moving. When ordered, Kane slammed his fist onto the table. "They're mocking us. A mob of nobodies with notebooks, and you're letting them control this city?" Harris's gaze was steady, almost tired. "They're not a mob, Kane. They're citizens. They're silent. And you," he leaned forward, voice low, "you're the reason they're here." The words struck harder than a blow. Kane's jaw flexed. "I've kept this city in line for years." "No," Harris said, his voice firm. "You kept it in fear. Fear doesn't last forever." The room fell silent. Kane felt eyes on him, not supportive, not loyal. Just watching, as though waiting for him to fall. That night, Kane walked the streets alone. His uniform felt heavier than ever, the badge, like a shard of metal cutting into his chest. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs of Sophia's words. A page taped to a lamppost. "We are the page that will not burn." A chalk line drawn across a wall. "Even in silence we rise." He tore them down furiously, shredding paper with trembling hands. But every corner he turned revealed more. They multiplied faster than he could destroy them. By the fountain in Jefferson Square, a group of children sat cross-legged, notebooks open on their laps. No adults, no chanting. Just children scribbling quietly under the glow of streetlights. Kane's throat tightened. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over them. "Go home," he barked. A little girl looked up, her gaze steady, unflinching. "We're already home." The words hit like a stone. Kane froze. Around him, passers-by stopped to watch. Phones lifted, recording. Their silence pressed on him like a weight. For the first time, Kane turned away. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't stay. Meanwhile, Sophia found herself sitting in a cafe with community leaders, teachers, and workers. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't planned it. But her words had pulled them. "Together like gravity, your essays have become a movement," said a teacher with tired eyes but a proud smile. Students quote you. Workers chant your lines in break rooms. Mothers copy your sentences into their children's lunch boxes. Sophia shook her head, overwhelmed. I never meant to lead. You didn't, the teacher replied softly. The words did. A factory worker leaned forward. They say Kane is cracking. He can't silence us anymore. He doesn't know how. Sophia felt the weight of it, not pride, but responsibility. She thought of the first page Kane had. Tried to burn. Its edges still scarred, but its words now written across the city. I only wrote the truth, she whispered. And truth is the one thing they can't tear apart. The worker said Doc Kane sat in his apartment later, his uniform jacket tossed across the floor. His television blared with news reports, silent crowds filling streets, people holding notebooks in the air, pages fluttering like banners. A reporter's voice rang. Authorities struggled to respond to unprecedented peaceful demonstrations. Sparked by the writings of an anonymous essayist. Anonymous. But Kane knew. He knew. He grabbed the page from his drawer, the one he had failed to destroy. He wanted to rip it apart now, to shred it, to erase it once and for all. But he couldn't. His hands trembled, the paper refusing to tear, as if the words themselves resisted him. No piece of paper should have this power, he muttered. But, deep down, he knew it wasn't the paper. It was the mirror it held up to him, a mirror that showed him for what he was. Days later, in front of City Hall, a crowd gathered. Thousands this time, silent, waiting, the air heavy, charged, like a storm before the break. Kane stood at the front line with his fellow officers. Sweat trickled down his neck. He scanned the crowd and for the first time saw Sophia. She wasn't leading, wasn't shouting. She simply stood among them, notebook in hand. Their eyes met. In that moment, Kane's chest constricted. She wasn't afraid. Not of him, not of his badge, not of his baton. The silence swelled. It pressed against him until he couldn't breathe. His voice cracked when he shouted, "Disperse!" But no one moved. Not a single soul. His fellow officers shifted nervously. Miller whispered, "They're not going anywhere." Kane's hand went to his baton, but it felt useless, a toy in the face of this stillness. He raised his voice again, desperate. "Go home." The crowd did not answer. Only notebooks lifted higher into the air, thousands of pages catching the evening light. And then, in the crushing silence, Kane heard it, the faintest whisper, carried from somewhere deep in the crowd. "We are the page that will not burn." The whisper grew, not into a shout, not into a chant, but into a tide of voices repeating softly, firmly, endlessly. "We are the page that will not burn." Kane's vision blurred. His badge felt like it was burning into his chest. He clutched it, his breath ragged. For the first time in his life, the symbol that gave him power felt like a curse. The badge had cracked. And Kane knew nothing could fix it. The courtroom felt like a battlefield in disguise. The flags hung motionless. Above the judge's chair, the seal of justice embossed behind him, cold and unfeeling. The whispers of the gallery crackled like dry leaves underfoot. Every seat was filled, reporters clutching their notepads, officers standing at the back with stiff postures, townsfolk drawn in by the promise of spectacle. At the center, Officer Grant sat hunched at the defense table. His arrogance, once so suffocating, had withered into silence. His eyes darted restlessly, searching for escape, but none existed. The torn notebook, its jagged edges now preserved in an evidence folder, lay on the prosecution's table like a relic of arrogance turned weapon. Then came the sound, heels clicking against the polished floor. The rhythm echoed sharp, deliberate, like a heartbeat that belonged to the city itself. The doors at the back of the courtroom had opened, and the air shifted. She walked in. Her presence was undeniable. Not flashy, not loud, but undeniable. She wore a simple black dress, her hair tied neatly, her gaze steady. She clutched a slim folder in her hand, the edges worn from being held too tightly. The whispers spread like wildfire. That's her, the judge's daughter. Judge Whitaker, for the first time since the proceedings began, faltered. His gavel slipped slightly in his hand before he recovered. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Miss Whitaker," he said, his voice taut, "this is highly irregular." But she didn't bow to him. She didn't shrink beneath the weight of the courtroom. She stood as though the entire space was hers. "I know," she said, her voice calm but carrying. "But so was tearing my notebook in half." A ripple spread through the courtroom. Officer Grant's jaw tightened, his face paling. He tried to speak, but the words snagged in his throat. She stepped forward, every stride cutting through years of unspoken expectation, of silence imposed upon her. When she reached the witness stand, she placed her folder on the edge. Her fingers brushed it gently, as though steadying herself. "I wrote in that notebook every day," she began. Her voice trembled for only a second before it found its strength. "It wasn't just notes. It wasn't just doodles. It was my truth, my fears, my reflections on this city, on its people, on the shadows that everyone pretends not to see." The jurors leaned in, their faces shifting, caught between curiosity and shame. She glanced at Officer Grant, her eyes piercing. "And you tore it because you thought you could. Because in your world, power means ownership of space, of rules, of people's dignity. But power is not ownership. Power is accountability." The room went still. The prosecution lowered their pens. Even the court stenographer, her fingers twitching over the keys, looked up in awe. Judge Whitaker's knuckles whitened around the gavel. "This is not," he began. "Father." The words struck the air like thunder. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly in that space, not as judge, but as parent. The gallery gasped. "You've hidden behind this bench long enough. You've allowed men like him to believe they are untouchable. You've silenced me because my truth didn't fit your world. But silence only feeds rot, and today the silence ends." Grant pushed himself up, desperate to reclaim ground. "She's lying. This is just some girl." "Some girl?" she snapped, her voice rising like a whip crack. "You didn't know who I was when you tore my words apart, but that doesn't make me less. It makes you smaller. Every word in that notebook was a mirror, and you couldn't stand to see yourself in it." The words slammed into the walls of the courtroom. Some in the gallery nodded slowly, tears pooling in their eyes. Others looked away, ashamed. Her father's chest rose and fell heavily. His mask of judicial authority was crumbling, not because of the evidence, but because of her voice. She had pierced the armor of the courtroom, speaking in a language sharper than Lotruth. She turned back to the jury. "This case is not just about me. It's about every voice dismissed, every story torn apart because someone in power thought it was disposable. My notebook was a small thing, fragile. But in tearing it, he revealed the fragility of something far greater, his own soul." Grant sat down hard, his bravado evaporating. His hands trembled against the table. The gallery stared, no longer at him, but at her, the young woman who had shifted the gravity of the room. Her eyes softened then, but only slightly. "The question is no longer whether he tore my notebook. We all saw who he is. The question is, what do we choose to do now that we know?" And with that, she closed her folder. The sound was final, like a chapter ending. The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was weight. Heavy, undeniable, transformative. The kind of silence that comes when a truth has been spoken so clearly it cannot be ignored. Officer Grant sank lower in his seat. The proud officer who once mocked, ripped, and sneered, now reduced to nothing more than a shadow at the edge of Justice Dodd and Judge Whittaker. His own daughter's words still echoing, had no choice but to look into the mirror she had held up before him. The balance of the room had shifted. The collapse had begun. The courtroom was no longer just a room, it was the eye of a storm. Outside, the sky pressed gray against the windows, heavy with clouds that seemed to lean closer, as though the heavens themselves were listening. Inside, the silence was thunderous. Every breath, every shuffle, every heartbeat carried the weight of history. Judge Whittaker sat frozen at his bench, his gavel still in his hand but powerless now. His authority, once unquestioned, hung limp in the air, overshadowed by the words his daughter had carved into the silence. His eyes darted from her to the jury, then to the gallery, searching for something to anchor him. But the anchors had all been cut loose. The prosecution rose, their voice steady but burning with new fire. "Your Honor," they said, with the testimony of Miss Whittaker, we have not just evidence of a torn notebook, but a revelation of character. Officer Grant's arrogance is not an isolated act, it is systemic, habitual, and emblematic of everything this courtroom claims to oppose. The defense tried to object, but their words collapsed under the weight of the gallery's stares. The people were no longer passive spectators. They had become witnesses to something greater than law, a reckoning. Officer Grant sat hunched, his once polished uniform now looking like a costume 2 sizes too big. Sweat dripped from his brow, his hands trembling against the table. His lips twitched as though trying to form a defense, but no words came. He had roared for so long, and now the silence devoured him. Then another sound, not gavel, not objection. A phone vibrated in the gallery, then another, then another. Reporters' devices lit up, the glow spreading like fire. The world outside. The courtroom was waking up. Live streams buzzed. Hashtags surged. Within minutes, the trial was no longer confined to 4 walls. It was broadcast across the globe. Screens in cafes, schools, offices, and living rooms flickered with the image of a young black man standing calm at the witness stand, a broken notebook preserved in plastic before him, and a young white woman, daughter of the very judge presiding, speaking. Truth that cut deeper than any legal argument. The world was watching. One reporter whispered, almost reverently, "This is no longer just a case. This is history." The prosecutor's words grew stronger. If justice means anything at all, it must mean that no one stands above dignity. No badge, no title, no bloodline. This case is not simply about punishment. It is about acknowledgement. It is about ending the silence that has choked this city for far too long. Grant exploded, his voice breaking at last. "You don't understand. I was just doing what I always do." "Exactly." The young black man's voice sliced through, calm but unrelenting. He had been silent for much of the trial, letting others tear themselves apart. Now his moment had come. He stood, his presence dignified, his voice carrying across the room. And that is the problem. What you always do is not duty, it is destruction. What you always do is strip dignity from those you think beneath you, but not today. Today the world sees you. Grant staggered back into his chair as though struck. His arrogance, his pride, his sneer gone. In its place was only a hollow man exposed before the very people he had once dismissed. Judge Whittaker raised the gavel, his hand trembling. For the first time, he looked not like a man in control, but like a man staring down the crumbling ruins of his own authority. His daughter's eyes locked with his. "Father," she whispered, but loud enough for the microphones to catch. "Do the right thing. For once. Do it." The silence stretched. The weight of the world pressed against his shoulders. And then, with a crack that echoed like lightning splitting a tree, the gavel struck. "This court finds Officer Grant guilty of misconduct, abuse of authority, and violation of civil rights. His voice broke, but he continued. Effective immediately, he is stripped of his badge, his rank, and his right to ever serve in uniform again. The gallery erupted not with chaos, but with a sound deeper than applause. It was the sound of relief, of vindication, of history breaking open. Some cried openly, others clasped hands. The air was heavy with something no one had felt in years. Hope. Officer Grant collapsed into his seat, his head falling into his hands. The badge that once gleamed on his chest was gone, taken by the bailiff, leaving nothing but fabric and shame. He was no longer untouchable. He was just another man who had fallen under the weight of truth. The judge's daughter stepped down from the stand, her step steady, her head high. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply walked to the young black man and placed the fan folder, the remnants of her torn notebook, into his hands. "These words were mine," she said softly, her voice carrying for all to hear. "But they belong to you now, because you kept your dignity when the world tried to strip it away, and because you turned silence into something unbreakable." He nodded, his eyes glistening. "No, they still belong to you. But now they belong to all of us too." And in that moment, it felt true. The courtroom wasn't just a place of judgment anymore. It was a place of rebirth. The cameras outside captured the crowd spilling onto the courthouse steps, black and white, young and old, hands clasped, voices rising. It wasn't just a verdict. It was a turning point. The story had left the walls of one room and had become part of the bloodstream of a nation. For the first time in years, the judge's bench felt small. The real power had always been with the people, those who spoke, those who resisted, those who refused to be silent. And as the final gavel echoed in memory, the message lingered like a flame that would not go out. Dignity cannot be destroyed. Truth cannot be silenced. Justice, once spoken, cannot be unheard.